have two people. That's six.
Hey, Terry.
Hey. Oh man. Sorry. There's a couple people in the room who are my fellows. Yeah. Uh, 5:30. So let me send them a message.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. I'm just messaging folks in the room. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, just hanging in.
Recording tonight's event, so we did want to let folks know. But we are super, super happy to have folks here tonight. My name is Terry Tao. I am the program director of the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute at Nexus Community Partners. I'm joined tonight with my colleague Chai Lee. Chai, if you could wave for folks who don't know. Um, uh, so, who is the BCLI program manager? And who has bravely put his number here in case someone has technical difficulties tonight. We are excited and really thrilled to welcome everybody to our first ever online virtual issue series to talk about this amazing topic around voting maps are power and what redistricting will mean to us. We have a wonderful set of presenters and panelists tonight who are going to talk about what they've seen, what they've been doing on the ground in regards to this work. And then tonight we will also have an opportunity for you all to kind of debrief and reflect on the things that you have heard from our presenters. If you haven't noticed already, in addition to the recording, we also have closed captioning happening here tonight to in case folks can follow along in that way as well. And so as we get started tonight, first, before I get started about the BCLI, kind of the goal of the issue series, I did want to do first a land acknowledgement too and talk about the Indigenous lands we're on and to honor and remember and also acknowledge and say that of the Indigenous people who we are presiding, whose lands we are on. So in this particular case, if we're in the southern part of the state, the Dakota communities, and then in the northern part of the state, if you're calling in from the Anishinaabe communities. And so we wanted to make that as we begin our events, something we do at all of our Nexus events. Next slide, Chai. You get then to talk a little bit about our goals. Oops, next one up. Oops, one more. The goals. Whoops. We're also going to ask for grace and patience with us tonight as we figure out how we're going to do this first virtual issue series. And so, folks may be familiar with the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute. It is our 7-month training program where we aim to get Black, Indigenous, and people of color on publicly appointed boards and commissions. We are excited to have members of our 8th cohort here tonight with us in addition to members of the public and partners. No, it is not. It is for the general public. Please know this is for everybody. Our fellows are just required to attend. So no, please join us for this event and hang out. These events are really designed, again, to be collaborative cross-sector events to build shared knowledge on issues that impact equity as well as racial equity in the Twin Cities, but also across the state, if not this issue, definitely across the country. We really are about having some shared learning and building community tonight. And in particular, we are really excited to be partnering tonight's issue series with Common Cause Minnesota. And we'll talk, which is a local grassroots organization, nonpartisan, that's really dedicated to upholding the core values of American democracy. They are working on solutions to reduce the influence of money in politics, hold public officials accountable, and create more representative government. And so they've been working and particularly on the census and ensuring that every vote counts and particularly so the elections reflect the will of the people and participate in a lot of co-governance, co-creation activities. So we're really excited. We'll hear more from their executive director, Anastasia, today, later too. But we're excited to be partnering with them to create the content tonight. Next slide, Chai. So as we are, and again, as we are navigating this space together, we ask that folks really, we have these shared agreements we'd like for folks to follow, which is one that we really commit to learning together, We're going to be talking about some things that our that may be new to us, some things that may be not so new to us. So just know that folks are at different learning points. Take space, make space. So maybe if you're, someone who wants to ask a lot of questions, I would ask that you probably take with the space you need, but also make space for others too. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we go to our debrief. To really push to create a brave space. Some of these issues are not going to be easy. They may be a little uncomfortable for us to talk about, and so the next one, oops and ouch, is related to that. That we may have moments or say things that we don't necessarily always know will be either offensive or be viewed that way to others, but to acknowledge that we do are engaging in this practice of democracy together in space too. And that it's okay to disagree. And I think, in particularly on this issue, we're going to talk about where there's been disagreement, right? Redrawing maps, very, very highly political, and so at both the capital P and lower P levels. And then we really ask for folks to speak from your own experience and use I statements tonight. So for folks to adhere to these group agreements would be great. In addition to that, because we are now in the era of Zoom times, we next slide, Chai. We also have some virtual agreements too. Oops. Which is one, obviously, to mute sounds, and obviously during the breakouts, unmute. We would love for you to chat with your small group members at that point. We are, as I mentioned before, we are recording. We know there are people who could not make tonight's event, and that once this is ready to go, we will be putting it up on the Nexus website. So check back in a few days where we'll post this. We would ask that folks use the chat to share any and clarifying questions, ideas, and thoughts. We are going to have, again, our breakout session will be when we come and do some more kind of debriefing and have an exercise where we'll come back with a more structured question. And it's okay to show up as you are. I know some folks, it's like, it's not, you haven't, you're just not feeling it. You gotta, you're gonna leave the video off. We totally understand. Well, we would love to see your lovely faces. There's some folks, we don't necessarily know everybody too. We understand if you want to keep your video off. And then of course host yourself and do what you need to do. I know 2 hours is the maximum, or even some people say it's actually a shorter period of time for Zoom attention spans. So we do ask folks, take care of yourselves um, throughout the evening. So I will take a deep breath and invite others to do that too. Um, but we will do, as I mentioned earlier, some of the things that we like to do here in community is to build community. And so our fellows know this, where we do a number of icebreakers. Next slide. So I'm actually going to do this lovely polling feature that we have in Zoom, right? And so, uh, but which gets at all the things now. We're in December, it's the end of the year. We've, for those who participated in last week's holiday, it's the holiday season. So we have a couple of holiday themed polls we want to share with folks. So I'm going to launch the poll now about holiday movies, desserts, and ideal holiday locations. And so folks could participate and jump in, share a little bit about what your thoughts and reflections about these categories here we've listed. That would be great. So I would invite, if anyone hasn't taken the poll yet, I would invite folks to take the poll of our initial icebreaker. Hopefully it pops up on your screen. I know sometimes the technology can be funky. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So can everyone see the results now on their screen? So a lot of folks different types of holiday movies, desserts, and other ideal holiday locations. Where would we rather be holidaying? Since the majority of folks picked other, I would invite any one or two people. Oh, hey Mary, see my friend Mary. Um, I would invite folks to anyone who said other to either drop in the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting, to share what other holiday movie. You'll see here I had a wide assortment of movies. um, I would invite anyone to drop in the chat what their other movie was that they felt was super important that they watch like every year. So
mine is sure to be an outlier. It's Fanny and Alexander. It's a Bergman movie.
oh, thanks, thank you.
Yeah, mine is the Home Alone series.
Oh yes.
And How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Yeah, DeAndre.
Donnie Darko. Somebody's writing in the chat. All right. So we have wide, varied taste. Thank you. Yes. How about anyone else who chose that other for favorite dessert? I'm glad to see cookies made a big holiday cookies. Big piece on here.
Yeah, I just put holiday cookies, but my choice dessert is sweet potato pie and banana pudding.
Yeah, those are great holiday desserts. Yeah.
Yeah.
This past week, yeah, certainly a lot of people indulging in that. And the last question and we're not in quarantine times. I wanted us to do a little bit of fun imagining ideal holiday location. And so not surprised that most people would rather be on the beach. You know, we are in Minnesota or the Midwest, right? So this is actually where my New York City inspiration came from, was from the Home Alone movies. But I'm surprised at the number of folks who are okay staying at home. I'm really surprised, folks. So, oh yes, Anastasia wants to be in Puerto Rico. Anyone else, which I would offer to share, unmute and talk about where else you would want to be, and ideal holiday location?
I always like to go to my kids' house in Georgia.
Oh yes.
Yeah, I love it there. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. And and somebody said South Africa. Okay, that's great too. Yes. Enjoying summer. Yep, the southern hemisphere. Well, thank you everybody. I think this was just a neat way to get to know folks. I'm laughing that Chai and I were having a conversation about Die Hard yesterday, the movie. So of course it's definitely a holiday favorite, I realize, for many people. So thanks everyone for sharing with us on holiday themed Zoom. So all right. So we're going to migrate now actually to the content for the evening. And so we're going to, so I've asked Anastasia Belladonna Carrera to talk a little bit about setting the context. So she's a current executive director for Common Cause Minnesota Now. I talked a little bit about what Common Cause did earlier in terms of being an independent grassroots organization, but her background is actually doing a lot of different policy level work. Prior to being at Common Cause, she was actually the legislative director at the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs, and so where she was doing legislative strategy for the state organization. Prior to that, she's done a lot of work with local, state, and federal government, and really working in partnership with different stakeholders, communities, and partners from various sectors. And so as Chai is going to get her slide deck up, and we will talk with the presenters about making sure the slide deck is available for everybody. But she'll give us a little bit of background of exactly what does redistricting mean? Why is it important? And then we will transition to our panels to talk a little bit about the work they're doing. So I turn it over to Anastasia.
Awesome. Thanks, Terry. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is doing fabulous this evening and you are stoked about walking through the next few minutes with me and how we try to figure out, for those of you that may not be too familiar with what redistricting is, I'm going to take a very basic sort of overview approach through it, but I'm going to also start tying in and trying to start connecting some of those dots, right? Like, how do we go? And there's why you see in that first slide, I try to set that tone, right? So for those of you that don't know me very well, I have a civil and human rights background. I am super ferociously passionate about re-empowering and really helping people find their own voice and navigate spaces of power, right? Because the decisions being made there are decisions that all of us live with day in, day out. It's not just something that stays on paper. So when we go through pain, protest, policy, and power, I have redistricting at the bottom and a base because it really does set the framework for that, right? So we move as community, we experience collective pain on a given issue, right? Many of us have been following the numerous protests and rallies that are addressing community needs and issues. And we've just certified the elections in Minnesota for one of the most contentious general elections in, I would say, modern history. And many of us have worked on many of the get out the vote efforts, right? Particularly within those marginalized and BIPOC communities, right? It's not new for many of us here on this call. So how many times haven't we collectively heard, and I'm doing the air quotes, vote your voice? Nice slogan, right? Vote your voice. But what does that really mean? How many of us have heard the frustration and seen people walk away from us as we're handing out our little register to vote clipboards, right? Folk are like, what I got to say or do ain't gonna matter much, right? So for the next several minutes, I'm gonna walk us through connecting some of those dots that I mentioned between our individual votes to moving policies that empower communities. And this, believe it or not, happens through a backdrop of redistricting, the shaping of our voting maps. That's where all of this really starts. So when we talk about voting our voice, whose voice is heard and whose is silenced within that process, right? So as we go through these slides together, keep this, I want you to keep this particular thing in mind. Our vote is our voice and collective power within local, state, and federal government. Next slide, please. So as I said, some of the topics that we're going to cover, and yeah, Terry, I would very much like if the slide decks would be shared with all of the participants. But what's redistricting, again, within the context of our real day-to-day, right? Like in the work that we're doing in re-enfranchising communities of color, particularly in other non-BIPOC disenfranchised communities, how does it affect me right where I'm sitting? How does it impact the power of my voice or my vote, right? And then I'm going to end up with just kind of letting you know what we're doing and giving you an invitation. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, sorry, I'm just making an adjustment on my end. So, I want to keep a couple of things in mind, some historical context that I think is really going to go a long way to really start seeing how those dots start getting connected, right? Before we get to the side where policy is already done. I think all of us on this call can agree that by the time you and I work with a particular bill that's just been released or policy that's been implemented in a agency level, the damage is done, right? We're just kind of navigating what is, right? So I want to give you a general overview very quickly. At a federal level, so back in the 1700s, when folks got together to shape a government structure for the newly formed colonies, believe it or not, that's how back this goes. They opted in creating a central federal government, right? So the centralized government would work on behalf of all the colonies. Easy breezy, right? However, they needed to figure out a way of dividing up that power and some of those resources. So they decided to do this in what we would call an equitable way this way. And that's the population. So they decided that's where you see the census being written into our Constitution, because they had to figure out some way of being able to divvy up that power that they were newly shaping and creating, right? So today, for example, the United States House of Representatives has only 435 seats. So how they go about in dividing which states get how many of those seats in our US House of Representatives is based on the census and that population, okay? So that's how that works at a federal level. That's called apportionment. At a local level, it's more redistricting. So once they figure out how many congressional seats the state of Minnesota is going to have based on the population, they communicate that information to our local government here, meaning the governor, the legislative body, and then the legislative body takes over that process for redistricting. And again, redistricting is just a fancy name for the shaping of our voting maps. So we're in that structure that I just mentioned to you. We're not a direct democracy. And that's also a very important and fundamental point that we need to really get clear on. We are not a direct democracy. We are a representative democracy. So every time a bill comes up at the Capitol for discussion, we don't run out to the polling places to vote on it, right? We rely on the elected official that we voted in to navigate that space of power and be our voice. Everybody on board with that? Cool. All right. So the system of government is dependent on one very powerful thing: one person, one vote, right? That's the great equalizer. It also relies on voters having a partnership of sorts with their elected officials. This is where the idea that speaks that the elected official speaks on our behalf comes from. And without these core pillars, democracy in essence, and the way it's set up falls apart, right? Is any of this kind of, I mean, I hope that I'm sort of hearing intellectual little bells and whistles going on in people's minds, because the more I talk about representative democracy and elected officials being our voice and vote, right? And that power, that inherent power, then some of you should be thinking, well, so how come is it then that we continue to revisit the same dagnarb issues over and over and over? Or so how come is it that in Minneapolis City Council or the school board in Minneapolis or at the state legislature, BIPOC communities are always having to argue the same things over and over and over again, right? So at a state level, when redistricting happens, that census information that I mentioned before is used to make adjustments in our district lines, right? And those adjustments in general are done so that there's a fairly the same number of people in each district, because we want to make sure that constituents have access to their elected officials. So if District 1A has 50,000 people living in it, and District 1B has 1 million people living in it, who do you think is going to have an easier time reaching their elected official, District 1A or District 1B? And so that's one of the things that fairness, right, tries to work through in how our district lines are adjusted. The other thing is that voters are not being disenfranchised. So that's the other thing that we should be looking out for, right? So when these adjustments are made to our voting maps, to our district lines, we need to also make sure that when they're doing that, they're not doing that in a way that disenfranchises some voters in one way or another. So the thing is that how those lines are drawn, as you can see, makes a big difference in some key areas. And again, this is where we start connecting the dots between our vote, who gets elected, and when policies are coming out, right? Through that foundation of these redistricting maps, these district maps, right? So the thing that I was mentioning has to do with a couple of these three key things. One, whether voters can elect a candidate that best represents who they are. So when these maps are redrawn, are they being redrawn to make sure that voters can elect a candidate that best represents the majority of the people in that district and how they see themselves? Two, giving a minority of the voters an unfair advantage over the majority. That should be ringing all kinds of whistles in people's minds, right? That's where you see a district where perhaps the policies of the person that was elected is completely opposite to the majority of the people that live in that district. And didn't I just say that a representative democracy means that the people that get elected is supposed to be the mouthpiece of that district, right? So that's the second thing we want to be looking out for, right? The third thing is it can create a situation where the minority of the voters elect a candidate that moves the minority agenda and not what's in the best interest of the majority. So what does that basically mean? You get a small portion of the district electing a politician, a candidate that moves policies that have nothing to do with the majority of the people in that district, right? So those are all things that we need to be looking out for, because those are all opportunities where communities in general, regardless of race, regardless of zip codes, lose power. And we started the conversation with the power of the one person, one vote, right? The power of the people, right? Next slide, please. So the timeline for when redistricting happens. After we receive the census information that I just talked to you about, there are actual deadlines that are set in the Constitution for the state that says that the drawing of the process that the legislature starts in creating how this is going to happen has to happen during the first legislative session after the census. So we just had the census, right? So that means that in 2021, when we just start, that process is kicked off in both chambers at the Capitol, right? The final deadline, in other words, that final drop dead deadline that has to happen for the maps, whatever districting maps are created, have to be moved and accepted 25 weeks before the primary election, so that districts, like local districts such as counties and municipalities, have time to reset their boundaries for precincts and wards and things like that. Make sense? Okay, next slide, please. Now we just hit the two different layers of what redistricting impacts, right? So we talked about redistricting involving the apportionment process, where those 432 seats are divvied up between all the states, right? And then we talked about how after that happens, that's communicated to the state. And then the states take care of the redistricting process, which is, as I said, the fancy word that just means making adjustments to our voting maps, to our district lines, right? Well, how that actually happens is determined by certain rules that are called principles, redistricting principles, right? There are two key federal principles that must be adhered to under US Constitution. And in a nutshell, it is these two. One, you got to make sure that there's an equal number of people living in each congressional district. And I believe the deviation is only one. So in other words, based on the census, when they're creating congressional districts, the difference in population between Congressional District 1 and Congressional District 2 can only be one person. That's how tight that is, right? Minnesota also has rules that has to do with that as well, and that's considered more of a percentage deviation, but we'll get that. That's like too much into the weeds. We can get into that at a different point. But just for now, one of those principles or one of those rules is that there has to be an equal number of people in the districts. And then the other one is that they cannot be drawn in such a way as to violate the Voting Rights Act. In other words, they cannot be drafted and changed in such a way that it targets a particular population of voters based on their race. At a state level in Minnesota, it varies. It varies in the sense that although they have legally been some core principles that in practice have been utilized when our state maps are being drawn, there is no real redistricting law per se that says these are the set of redistricting principles that must be adhered to every time the cycle happens, with the exception of the two federally required ones. There are some other principles that are in fact utilized the majority of the time. And again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the actual principles. I just want to make sure that you walk away and knowing that there are federal rules and that there are state rules in Minnesota. Those rules determine essentially if the maps that come out of the process work for the community or if it works for the incumbents and the parties. This is where community must be hands-on. This is where building power for community happens, right? And so in the process of drawing these maps at the legislature, and if you go into the next slide, I can get into more details of what I mean by that. So in Minnesota, redistricting happens at the state legislature, okay? And it's moved as any other bill would be moved. And it is actually passed out of chamber as with any other move with a simple majority, okay? Because it's moved as any other bill, the governor has the ability to veto the redistricting maps that are presented, okay? Should that happen, the Supreme Court or the court steps in. And then when I say steps in, I mean literally, and that is accounted for in the Constitution. And by that means that they literally usurp the process. They then go about in establishing what process they're going to have public hearings for community to engage and come and talk about how they see themselves as a community. And they call it the community of interest. But all that really is a fancy term to say that they want to better understand how these communities culturally, industry-wise, or through other identifiers see themselves and should be kept together. So like, let me give you an example of what I mean by a community of interest. I think all of us here on the call can really relate to me describing a particular Native reservation as a community of interest, right? But if you look at the central northern quadrant of the state, you're going to find that the Native reservation that's located there is actually divided into, I believe, 4 different districts. So what do you think are the chances of that community being able to elect a Native person into office when their community of voters have just been diluted in so many different districts? You see the connecting of those dots? How likely do you think Native issues that are impacting community members in that community gonna make it percolated into the agenda of priorities for the representatives and the senators that community's divided and diluted into? See how that works? So the important thing to really think about here is that last question that I just highlighted. So redistricting happens in Minnesota at the legislature. Politicians, the legislative members who are supposed to be who? Our elected officials. They're supposed to be speaking for who? Our communities, right? Their respective communities. But would it surprise you if I told you that in the last, I'm sure the panel will get into this a little more detail. Let's just say, since I think it's been what, the last at least 40 years, we have not successfully moved a bipartisan redistricting map that truly puts Minnesota voters first. Okay. And as a result, it's gone to the courts. And that's a problem. And I'm going to tell you why in just a sec. But for now, I just want to ask you this. How's that work for BIPOC and poor communities in Minnesota? How has the legislative body being in control of the redistricting process of shaping our electoral maps worked for us so far? I would say it hasn't. Our Minnesota legislature, I would describe as fairly dysfunctional. Many good policies have died on the floor or in committee because the party in control won't allow the minority member bills to get hearings. I'm sure many of you here on the call might have either read that or experienced that as you've been engaging in grassroots efforts to move various reforms through or to get a particular policy heard in committee, whether it's the Senate or the House. So this is something that happens in both chambers, regardless of who's in power. One of the biggest false narratives is that redistricting is a very political process. Don't fall for that. It's not. Just like the census belongs to the people, I would argue that the drawing of our voting maps are supposed to serve us and not the incumbents or the parties. That's where they try to confuse and take over the narrative that it's too political. It's too much of a hot potato to touch. Ain't no hot potato. Your job is to represent us. How do you figure that's a hot potato? Now, if you start talking to me about your party dynamics and your larger strategy to take over the world, well, yeah, then I could see how that becomes an issue of politics. But no, we didn't send you to the Capitol for politics. We sent you to the Capitol to represent the constituency that voted you in, right? That's why it's so important. You see why I say that at the seat of our ability to vote someone in that's going to speak to the issues that impact our communities is the redistricting process. That the fact that they failed to move that speaks to that, I believe. Next slide, please. This is what I kind of pulled together after working this issue for about 4 years. It's the best way that I can visually show you what the dilemma is. And I'm air quoting dilemma. There is the legislator represented in the yin and yang sign, power and fairness, right? The constituent interest is all in the right-hand bubbles. You want to represent my community. I want to work together. I want to do a good job for democracy and for Minnesota, right? I want to do the right thing. But then here are all these other bubbles that, in my opinion, is completely irrelevant and shouldn't even be an issue for them. Is they want to protect their seat, they want to strengthen their party, they want to advance their agenda, right? Next slide, please. Remember I mentioned before that when the legislative body failed to move bipartisan maps, that the courts step in to remedy any kind of legal issue, clearly, that is at the heart of why the maps were vetoed, or why these maps, why they were stalemate, or while somebody filed a lawsuit, which is usually what happens. I believe that's how it's initially kicked off as well. And so the courts step in to go ahead and take over the process of drawing those maps. They have hearings. They invite community in and other stakeholders and industries and whoever wants to come in and really talk about who they are as a community and why that community should be preserved, and why that community should be preserved at the cost of perhaps structuring local or keeping local structure in place, like the county lines or the city lines, right? Many politicians will argue that if you move those district lines, you're going to change who their voters are. And that you should actually help voters by keeping those boundaries the same no matter what. Because that encourages, that's a bunch of crap, in my opinion, and it's Common Cause's position as well. We believe that if your boundary lines change and you have a new chunk of new voters, I don't know, door knock, get to know your voters, convince them to vote you back in. That's what you're supposed to be doing. But keeping lines the same just because it suits the local structure, the local government structure at the cost of community is not acceptable. Because again, we would argue that those voting maps belong to us, not the other way around. Next slide, please. So this is where the rubber meets the road. And I am winding down. This is what really is of significance in what I want you to walk away with. How does redistricting impact our communities? What is make every vote count? Why would even that sign be up? Which is one of our partners, national partners in moving redistricting reforms. It's voter focused and not party and incumbent focused, right? How voting maps are drawn determine if communities of color or any community can elect representatives of choice, whether it's on the school board or at the congressional level. That's where power comes in. The power of one and collective power. Who is heard and who is silenced in this process? That's where you hear some of that pain that bubbles up from community. We don't understand. How can it be? How can it be that despite all of the movement that went around after the murder of George Floyd, who here on this call can walk me through the reforms that came out of it? How can that be? And it wasn't just in Minnesota, we're talking global. How can it be that other states were able to actually move reforms, by the way, with Republicans in charge? But in Minnesota, we can't seem to move past it. Why? Whether elected officials respond to our needs goes to the heart of what I just mentioned. Pain, protest, power, policy. How are we going to get from one to the other, to the other, to the other? It sets up a system of whether voters are selecting candidates or candidates, incumbents, are selecting voters, right? So how can we elect someone who sees us, hears us, and will work with us if our district lines are drawn to silence us? How are our elected officials supposed to be responsive to our issues if the district is drawn to give them or their parties a chokehold on that district seat? So my ask is that while the mice, what is it? While the cat's away, the mice will play. I can give you the fox in the hen house. I mean, there's a buffet, right, of things could be shared that depicts the dynamic that I'm trying to create here to get you all to just start. This is just an invitation to start viewing this process of drawing our voting maps as a process of collective power, not political power, community power. people power, our vote matters power, right? That's where we're at this process right now. We're about to engage in the next year and a half or so into exactly this. This is an opportunity for our voice to be meaningfully heard within these spaces of power. And in the past, I feel the community hasn't really been educated enough in connecting those dots, that although they really want to be a part of this process, they feel insecure in navigating these spaces and these discussions of power because they're not familiar with the terms or the nuances of what this means. But if there's the one thing I want you to walk away from this discussion is the following. It is one vote, one voice. It is responsive representative democracy. We are the ultimate powers in the net structure, and our redistricting maps belong to us. Having said that, last slide, please. Or actually, second to the last slide. What can you do? Engage directly in defining our communities. When this process opens up, they're going to be having hearings, and they're going to be accepting suggestions on even how the district should look like from community directly. Be engaged. Work with us to make sure that when it's Minneapolis's, or if you're in greater Minnesota, when it's your time, when it comes to your area to submit, or you know, because we're going to make sure you know of all the opportunities there are, I want you to really be engaged in that process. Educate others. Help us to start making these connections between pain, protest, public policy, and power for others in the community, no matter where you are, whether it's greater Minnesota or here. This isn't a BIPOC issue. Let me just repeat that. This is not a community of color issue. It just so happens that those that manipulate this process do so with an intent to either isolate, disenfranchise BIPOC communities, right? Or give themselves an unfair advantage. That's just the bottom line. Because I can sit here and also tell you that in Illinois, the Democrats have gerrymandered the heck. Gerrymandering means manipulation and cheating in the process to keep Republicans out. So this is not unique. This is not the issue. The problems of manipulating this process for self-advantage isn't unique to Republicans. This is something that is about power, and power does not like to give up power, right? Partner with our alliance. We're going to be having, oops, I made a, oh no, I didn't. We're going to be having a blueprint convening. Hopefully we'll be able to share some more information through Terry as well. So I'll reserve the time for that detail later, but sort of flag the 17th from 10 to 1 on your calendars, and we'll be sending you more information after that. And the last slide is my direct contact information. It's going to be a space that we want to create to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and really own, be present in these processes of shaping our district maps, whether it's helping you create your own district map as a community, or helping you and educating you on how to come and testify about what you want to see and how your district is drawn. If you have any questions, we'll take them at a later point. But other than that, thank you all so much for your attention and your patience, and hopefully we'll have lots of questions later on.
Thank you. You've done a great job.
Yeah. So Chai is going to transition to our next slide deck. I would ask that if there are any clarifying questions, drop them in the chat. Otherwise, wait for the big process questions when we go to the debrief. So as we get started here, Chai's gonna pull up the slides for our next presenter. But so thank you, Anastasia, for giving us kind of the context and background about the issue of redistricting, as well as kind of the history and the facts of what got us here today, and the context that we're operating in. And about working towards a more representative democracy. Next up, we have X Hyung-Bo, or XP Lee, who is actually a public policy manager at the Minnesota Council on Foundations, which is really interesting. And while he's at the Council on Foundations, he actually coordinated the 2020 Minnesota Census Mobilization Partnership, and now is co-coordinating a community-focused effort of organizations that are dedicated to uplifting voter voices in this redistricting process. And so XP's passion is about working with democracy issues because of the ability to inspire and empower people for lifelong lasting change. So we'll turn over to XP to talk a little bit about what he's seen this year and what he's thinking about moving forward.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Terry and Chaya Nexus for this opportunity to speak with everyone tonight. And thank you everyone else for participating and joining us. Redistricting is a natural follow-up process to the census, because the census data feeds right into the apportionment process, as Anastasia had described earlier. So again, there are only 435 seats in the House of Representatives, and based on our numbers from the 2020 census, which the Census Bureau is right now computing, they're going to, divide those seats among the states. And I don't know how many of you may know this, but in 2010, Minnesota was on the cusp of losing our 8th congressional seat. We kept it in 2010 by about, I think it was like about 20,000 people, 20,000 people. And so this time around in 2020, our 8th congressional seat is also at risk of being lost. So think about the political leverage and influence that would mean for the state that we would lose, as well as other funding and other financial opportunities and tax dollars that would come through that office to its community if we didn't have that 8th congressional seat. So we did our best. My previous boss was director of policy at Minnesota Council on Foundations. His name is Bob Tracy. Some of you may be familiar with him. He started having conversations with some other local partners like Joe Naymark from the Minnesotans for the American Community Survey, and our state demographer, Susan Brower, back in 2015, to be able to get ready for engaging communities around making sure that everyone is counted for the 2020 census. So we got involved, MCF got involved through a dedication to making sure that all of our historically undercounted communities, all of our historically underrepresented, underserved communities, BIPOC communities had an equitable chance at being counted and therefore being seen in census data. And not just for the purposes of redistricting, but also because census data is the base foundation of data set, that the Census Bureau will use to be able to, augment and inform other data for the next 10 years. And then all of this data from the Census Bureau, based on the 2020 census, will also be used by other private entities and other organizations, to be able to make their decisions in other sectors of life as well, from financial institutions to healthcare, to recreation, to other investments that will affect our communities for the next 10 years. So we wanted to make sure that our numbers were seen, especially the numbers of our historically undercounted communities in Minnesota. And if you're not quite familiar with that term, the more general term from the Census Bureau is hard to count communities. And so we wanted to turn that around, because we wanted to empower community by saying that it's not the community's fault that they're hard to count. it's been the systemic flaws of the Census Bureau and the process of counting that hasn't been able to really uncover the true numbers of the community. So that's why we use the term historically undercounted communities. And when we first started pulling individuals and organizations together from these historically undercounted communities, we based it on the principle of relational organizing. And so relational organizing for us meant that we were pulling together a coalition of organizations that would be trusted messengers to be able to get trained and then to be able to pass on that training to their staff and their volunteers. And then those staff and volunteers would then be able to host more local trainings with their constituents or clients or neighbors even. And then, our goal, this was pre-COVID, heading into 2020, was to be able to try to get as much peer-to-peer conversation around the messages of a fair and equitable and complete 2020 census count as much as possible. So that was our approach. Again, unfortunately, COVID hit earlier this year. We had to adjust a lot from our in-person strategies to virtual. We all, I'm sure, have that experience. So it really threw a big wrench into our strategy, but we still continued to connect through phone calls, through virtual and social online platforms. And so the result of all of our work and all of our preparation is that Minnesota had the highest self-response rate of any state in the country. So our self-response rate is 75.1%. And that beats our 2010 response rate as well as our 2000 response rate. So that's an awesome accomplishment. All of you, I'm sure had a hand in it in some way. So we should all be very super proud of that accomplishment. And that also gives us the confidence to be able to say that, hopefully that was enough to help us keep our 8th congressional seat. But we'll find out towards the end of this year. So I give you all of that context in order to say that the relationships, the momentum, the coalition across sectors, as Minnesota Council on Foundations, we worked with a lot of our partners, including Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, the State Demographer's Office. We connected with the Census Bureau, their Minnesota Partnership Coordinator and specialists. We worked with Common Cause Minnesota and League of Women Voters. I mean, a lot of cross-sector work. And so once that ended in sort of controversial, well, highly controversial fashion in October, you may be aware of that, we wanted to pivot to redistricting. And so we set ourselves up to do that. And we're wanting to pool all of our momentum and all of our partners and allies that we had been able to rally around the 2020 census to redistricting. So, that's why Anastasia and I have been working closely together. We continue to work closely together as we head into redistricting here. And apologies, I had some slides to kind of help talk about that, but it's all good. We'll jump into this slide here. So again, census data goes to the Minnesota legislature and governor, and but you know, historically, like in like the past, what correct me, you guys, but like 4 or 5 decades, the legislature has not been able to pass a bill by itself. So click next, Chai. So what has happened is that it has gone to the Supreme Court, and so you know, the court has, you know, done what it can every time to be able to put up a process, and then to be able to you know, like force a decision on a map, because that's what their legal responsibility is. But again, to Anastasia's point, you know, it doesn't really truly represent the voices of us, the people, the voters. Click next, Chai. So what the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy and the rest of us are coming together to do, click next, Chai, is to come up with an approach heading into 2021 that will allow for all of us to come together at different points, wherever we feel comfortable as individuals and or organizations, to be able to plug into a larger process to help to give voice and raise our concerns, and how we would draw our maps, you know, and make sure that that is plugged into the top line process. Click next, Chai. So we have the government track, and then we have the legal track, which obviously, you know, is really straightforward. I mean, the organizations and the individuals in those tracks will continue to monitor the legislature, and to, you know, work with our elected officials, and prepare documents, and work with everyone to be able to shape language as well as timelines as the process moves forward. Click next, Chai. But our community track is really where we want to be able to focus. There's a lot of conversation, because we are a state where we don't have an independent, you know, commission yet. If we want to work towards one, this is an opportunity for us to show and to role model what that might look like, right? Other than that, you know, obviously, redistricting is also a kind of a buried and hidden democratic process that not a lot of us really understand yet, unless if we've been, you know, in the weeds, or a data nerd for a long time. We might not have really understood it. So click next, Chai. Click, go ahead, click next a couple more times. 1, 2, yeah, that's good. So there's a couple different ways you can plug in: meetings, monitoring, mapping, and then what we plan to do is create a parallel commission that will work independently from the government process, and that, you know, all of our work at the ground level, you know, creating community of interest maps that will feed into unity maps, that will feed into actual district maps, that will you know, help to inform all of the conversation, and then you know, hopefully be viable ultimately when the final maps are drawn. You know, there's a lot of ways to plug in, and if you know, if you just want to hold educational meetings and trainings, that's awesome. If you want to be part of the monitoring, that's awesome. If you want to be able to host your own mapping activities, that's awesome too. So it's really up to you. And before I end, if you could go click Next, Chai. One more. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to just share this out. We've got a 101 or 102 redistricting webinar call coming out next Friday. I'll post the information, but Minnesota Council on Foundations is really dedicated to this democracy area because we also are aligned with the Joyce Foundation and their dedication to it as well. And we feel the same way, that this is a critical element of our democracy, and not only from a DEI and equity perspective, but also from a community empowerment perspective. So I just wanted to end it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, XP, talking about some of the additional work of what advocates are doing on the ground and concurrent to what is happening at the formal level. And so as we talk about redistricting, we wouldn't be complete without having someone who has actually worked on, in addition, somebody who's worked at these issues at the state level. So tonight, I'm really glad we have Thomas Freeman here, who is joining us currently right now, is an attorney and government relations director at the firm of Faith Greek Drinker. But before that, what's really important is that Tom was the deputy political director for the House Republican campaign committee from 2010 to 2012, right? So which was drawing those maps right after the 2010 census. And in particular, Tom was the committee administrator, where he was responsible for the legislative congressional district boundaries and developing the legal strategy. So Tom's going to talk a little bit about, with his legal hat on, about his experience and what's happened at the state level too. So Tom?
Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Chai, and everybody for participating. It's great to see so many people interested in a great topic like this. I wish we were all in person, and I hope all of you are staying safe and that your families are staying safe through the holiday season. Yeah, I don't want to belabor this, because I do want to get to questions. I think that's the most important way for all of us to learn together. So I'll go through this fairly quickly as an effort to try and not repeat anything that Anastasia or XP covered. And I'll just also say, please do sign up for any opportunity to learn how to draw the maps, because I think that is also a really important learning exercise for the challenges and kind of the push and pull of varying priorities that you may have when you're drawing the map, and how you try to balance that out. I think it's a really interesting exercise that might put some things that you learned today into perspective. So Chai, if you can go forward, keep going. One more. So this is just a timeline that comes from the Minnesota House of Representatives Research Department. And I'll share the slides too with Terry afterwards in a proper format. You can all get this, but this is really a draft scenario under what I would consider is the most likely scenario to happen under our political reality after the elections, with a divided legislature, which means that the court is likely to be involved. And I think everybody's touched on that since 1980, our legislative process has not gone very well. And I just want to point out two key dates. December 31st is the date where we'll know if we do keep that 8th congressional district. It's unknown. There's some early indications that we may not, but as XP eloquently talked about, we were estimating that we were going to lose a seat last time as well. And then February 15th is that date that Anastasia talked about, where of 2022, where that's the 25 weeks prior to the primary election. So those are kind of the key dates. A lot of time in between now and then. So if you can go forward, Chai, that'd be great. We generally covered redistricting principles. Broadly think of principles as kind of guidelines and rules to follow when creating your map. If the legislature were to pass a bill, they will they will pass a principal bill prior to passing a map. It generally is supposed to outline some things to go over is like numbering, how do you actually go through the process of numbering all the legislative districts, and where do you start, where you're supposed to finish. It's actually a process for that. Nesting, which is a principle of keeping 2 House districts contiguously inside 1 Senate district. How are you going to handle communities of interest? Anastasia did a great job of talking about communities of interest and how that can be utilized. It can also be abused by whoever's in power or whoever's drawing the map. The court, for example, actually referred to different economic interests as a community of interest. And so depending on your bent on a variety of issues, you could do just about anything to create your own community of interest. And I think that's important to know. So if you want to go to the next slide, Chai, that's kind of a good example. There are differences between the congressional and legislative principles. Some key ones, as Anastasia talked about, there is no variance between your districts from a congressional standpoint. It's supposed to be down to 1 person. That is the technology available can allow for that, and it's not as difficult as it might sound. But at the legislative level for the state maps, that variance is generally around plus or minus 1%. And so you can really change a map by packing or cracking different communities of interest, or packing certain populations together, or expanding a map in a way where certain parts of the state have more population than the ideal district size, or less than that. And what I mean by that is, if you wanted to make sure that a certain part of the state was overrepresented, you would actually undercount their ideal district size so that they have more power because they represent fewer people. I think that's something that we'll talk about later. And then I talk about splits here, and that's kind of talking about how many times is a city or a county split up or dissected into multiple districts. And that has a double-edged sword, because some cities through the 2010 process, we learned, actually testified that they wanted to be split up as many times as possible. Their city council and their mayor testified that they thought that would mean that more legislators would have to listen to their issues and would take them more seriously. And we had other cities that obviously testified saying, we don't have more population than an ideal district, so we would like our city to be wholly within 1 district. So it's very interesting to see how different cities think about that conundrum. Next slide, Chad. Kind of talk about, this is a round peg in a square hole. When we talk about redistricting from a broad standpoint, it'd be great if every district was a circle or a square. That would be ideal. Rock County in southwest Minnesota is about as close as you can get to a perfect square of a political boundary that I've ever seen. That's not really the reality that we deal with, and it's unfortunate because it'd be a lot easier. I also say, as a map drawer, you can't color outside the lines. So when you're drawing your maps, and I think this will be the thing you learn the most in that exercise, is obviously the state boundary is our boundary. We can't borrow territory from Canada or Wisconsin. And so what ends up happening is the first time you would draw a map, and I have this experience, it was horrible looking. You end up with kind of a blob in the middle of the state that you don't know what to do with. And because you started in a certain spot, the blob might end up in a different place. And so it really is kind of interesting to go through that process. Do you want to go to the next slide, Chad? And so I put this, that not all districts are created visually equal. some are uglier or less aesthetically pleasing than others. And so on the left, you have House District 1B, which is in northwest Minnesota. And the white part of that district is the actual district boundary line. It's pretty square, pretty uniform. And then on the right, you have the communities that border or kind of connect around Lake Minnetonka. And that district, if I were able to do one of those ink blot pictures that we might have seen, that district would look really funky and really weird and would make no sense kind of outside of the context of being around that lake. But obviously, those communities have a lot in common based on their reliance on economic interests around the lake, et cetera. And it actually does make some sense. And that's Kelly Morrison's district in the House. So if you want to go next slide, Shai. I talk about this as, buzz phrases in redistricting can often be political landmines. And so I just caution us all to be thoughtful about that and kind of open space, the fair maps, fair to who? Just keeping that in mind, what's fair to you might not be fair to somebody else on the call. And so we have to balance kind of all of those things. Independent commission, we talk about independence. What are we trying to create? Are we trying to create an independent commission with experience? Sometimes commissions that have retired politicians, sometimes they have retired judges. You can kind of make up your mind about that. We've talked about the last one. If you want to go to the next slide, I've just got a couple more. I'm close to time. I just want to say reform is not a bad word. Not as somebody who's kind of talked through the process and dealt with the process. Certainly there are some things that need to happen. I'll give one great example that's happened in the last 20 years. So each of the last redistricting cycles. I hope if the judiciary has to draw the map, that they will hire a nonpartisan individual with a GIS degree, which is a mapping degree, because there's a lot of sloppiness that went on in the last 2 times. And one example is they have drawn a boundary line directly through a retirement home in Edina 2 times in a row. And then both instances were told by the city of Edina, please don't do this. Because that will be detrimental. And literally individuals down the middle of their hallway were in different boundary lines. And that's just absurd and shouldn't happen. Next slide, Chad. We can talk about this later about kind of the partisanship. I think there's ups and downs based on the political reality for Democrats and Republicans and what they're going to try to do. But I want to just say, both sides will be trying to gain an edge. I don't think that's a shock to anybody on the call. And there's a lot of positives and negatives depending on what party you're from. Next slide, Chad. And then this is the last slide. We don't know how many members of Congress will be allocated in the apportionment. That's an open question. Governor Dayton's office was not very involved in the process last go around. They did not submit separate maps, kind of left it to the legislature. He obviously appoints the governor, he appointed a staff member who was involved in the process a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see if Governor Walz, what path he takes. I think it'll be interesting to watch if the House Democrats pass an independent commission bill as opposed to passing a map. And I think it'll also be interesting if given the virtual nature of this, if both sides kind of retreat and don't pass a map and just go straight to a court process. That will be interesting to watch. Who's on that judicial panel? It's appointed by the Supreme Court justice. It's not all Supreme Court justices. It's other judges. And they generally function like a legislative body, and it's very weird. I'm back on my reform slide. I'll just end with, I don't really think that's what a judge signed up to do when they wanted to be a judge. And I don't think that that's really what we had thought of in terms of the process. And I think there are ways to make it better. So I'll just stop there. I know that was really quick, but I just wanted to make sure we left a lot of time for collaboration and communication tonight. So thank you, and I really appreciate everybody's time.
Well, great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, XP, and thanks, Anastasia, to our speakers to give us the context, the political realities of what we're dealing with when we talk about redistricting, how simple and not very simple the issue is. So we've heard a lot of information tonight. And what we want to do, and what we've actually would be doing in person at these issue series, is now going to a point of debrief. So what we're going to do is chat. We are now going to ask you to kind of sit and reflect. What did you hear tonight? What was new information? What was new information? What and collectively, your task will be in your small group, your randomized small group. You'll be with about maybe about five, 6 people to come up with a collective question, right? And so I often find, even myself when I attend these events, there's a lot of information that's passed. So we want to do a little bit of debrief and a little bit of meaning making. And then your task in your small groups is to come back with your collective question. We'll drop those questions into the chat once we all get back, and we'll give folks maybe about 15-20 minutes to kind of do this debrief, and then we'll come back and we'll answer them. Chai?
Sorry, I don't see the breakout thing at the bottom of my toolbar.
All right, I got it. I have it on mine. So yeah. So we will, I'm going to ask the speakers to don't go into your breakout rooms, just stay in this main room here. But everybody else, you need to take a break, come back, but I hope you have really good conversations and to come up, with your collective questions. So, all right, thank you, and have good conversations. We'll let you know, we'll give you the little timer countdown too. So see you in about 15-20 minutes, everyone. And please click on the invitation when it says join breakout room. Hope everyone had really good conversations. Folks came up with some good collective questions. Please, I would ask right now if folks to drop the questions into the chat, and then Anastasia had a quick little errand run. Hopefully she's back on the call, but otherwise XP and Tom, I would defer to you all as questions come in, unless someone really wants to unmute and ask their group question, then go for it. And I will call on rooms. You know I'm not shy.
Well, you know I'm not shy. This is Sean. Hello, everyone. We had a pretty robust conversation with Sam, DeAndre, Erica in that particular group, and we had a few questions, but I think we landed on 3. But we're going to start with 1 and see what the other groups have offered up. So the first one we want to offer up is with regards to sovereign nations, and that question is, how are sovereign nations, the Native American community, considered in redistricting? How is they're a sovereign nation? So are they historically, have they been split, or they come in as one whole? So yeah, that was our first question.
Oh, great question, Sean. They are federally protected. So from a congressional standpoint, they are not split. And the legislative process is generally, you try to, I mean, there's an attempt in every effort to keep them together. Thinking Anastasia mentioned think it's the Red Lake tribe. Not all of their tribal property is contiguous within one boundary, so it's very difficult. So that is given a little more leeway when folks are drawing the map, or when courts have drawn the map. But generally speaking, they try to avoid that, and also pay attention to where the actual population within that tribal property is. So if something that's not it might be tribal grounds and it's federally protected, but nobody lives in those areas. That's something different that they don't want to, that they feel more comfortable splitting. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, and a slight follow up from me,
Yeah.
and I'll let the rest of the group add, is very quickly is if we're considering them and we deem them as sovereign nations, has there been conversations around them having their own representative?
I think Terry, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think that was the recent one with Oklahoma, right? Where there was the nation there. I think I might want to say the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma that appointed someone recently, hadn't for years, and just realized that they could. So, but I don't know if anyone else has any other information to share.
Yeah, I haven't had that conversation. It's been a while since I was really involved, so I might be dating myself, but I haven't seen that conversation percolate as much as I know. I think it was Megan had a conversation about the prison populations. That was something that was talked about at length in the last redistricting process here in Minnesota. And I can just quickly touch on that in Minnesota, the prison populations are counted where the prison is, not where the individual reside or resides before they entered the prison system. So, and that's I guess that's quite common. I know other states, it's been a reform issue that I know Common Cause has been part of, and other states have changed that as well. So there are other states that do it differently.
Great. Any other rooms? I would be inviting folks to one of the groups. Jody's group dropped a question in the chat for XP and Tom. I don't know if you saw that about this question about education, folks. So, and Jody was in group 2, room 4. She was in room 4. So yeah. Any thoughts or reflections about their collective questions?
Well, I think you're all doing it tonight. I think you're learning more about a really important part of our process that I like to call it the most important process not many people know about or pay attention to. And that's not a slight on anybody. I think that's just something we all need to work on. But I think through programs like this, what XP's group is doing through the census, your voice can matter. And the court, whether it's a legislative process or a court process, they will take testimony, written and in person. And I think there are instances where you can make a very big difference in defining, I think Anastasia referenced to this, defining what your community. And so if your community line is maybe commonly known by somebody as one street boundary to another street boundary, but that's not accurate or it's evolved, you need to say that to those that are drawing the maps, because things change over time and we're not a static society. And I think getting involved in submitting those documents will be very helpful. I think, Jody, were you going to comment on that?
Well, I just want to ask a follow-up question about that, because part of our discussion was about, individuals getting involved in the process. So I know that 10 years ago, because I participated in it myself, Common Cause hosted forums where people could learn more and practice the mapping. And that was a really, as someone said earlier, a very instructive exercise. But then later, as part of the research I was doing, I pulled things out of the public record in terms of testimony. And I found that some folks in more or less the same neighborhoods were advocating for different things. So what I'm interested in hearing about is what we kind of were talking about is this tension between advocating for what I identify for myself as my community of interest, and what my neighbors or people in the district next to me who would be affected if I shifted my boundary, if I had some influence or got a bunch of people to testify and we were successful at shifting a boundary, what effect would that have on another community of interest? So can you talk a little bit about, maybe this is directed to XP, like what a collective effort would look like in terms of elevating voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, so that that competition isn't happening in the process itself? Like, what's a more collective response than just like each of us learning it and advocating for what we see?
Right. Thank you so much for that question. It is one of the issues that we're trying to clarify, and for us to be able to better facilitate those conversations at the Blueprint meeting. And I was able to drop in my email address and a link to next Friday's Redistricting 102 presentation. So that's on our website, mcf.org. You'll have to create a web account on our website to be able to register, but that's pretty straightforward. Let me know if you have any issues with that. And then we do have the sign up sheet for the Redistricting Blueprint convening, which will be Thursday, December 17th from 10 to 1. So that's going to be our first big convening to be able to try to map out some actionable steps heading into 2021. To your point, right now I'm not very familiar. I think Tom probably could speak more to the process that happened in 2010, but the executive director for Common Cause at that time was Mike Dean, and we've been able to connect with him to be able to get some information on how they were able to coordinate. And so we're all starting to have those conversations right now. If you can kind of think back to my diagram that I had shown in my slideshow with the 3 prongs and the community track having the meetings and monitoring and mapping levels. So it's really going to be open-ended. Right now, what we have going is we have knowledge of various mapping applications. There's one in particular that is like the top of the line. That's Maptitude. That's the one that the legislators and officials are going to make the official maps with. Everything else that's available should be able to plug into that, so people can try to make their own, as has been said. But we're going to try to finalize 1, maybe 2 that we're going to work with within our coalition, and try to help make available to grassroots organizations and other groups and organizations who would be interested. And along with that, we're going to try to provide some training and some guidance as well, right, around that. And then there's different levels of mapping. 2 main levels. One is called unity mapping, and that's where community groups are various community groups or associations are trying to map their definition of their neighborhood, of their community of interest. And then once those are done, at some point, there's a process of overlaying those to try to come to some kind of a consensus in terms of how that will look and define the overall community as it pertains to the actual district lines that will be drawn through and or around the community. So there's the actual drawing of the district lines, which will probably be done more by like the wonks and the technical people and some of the other organizations that will have that technical ability, and the government, obviously. Maybe like Tom says, maybe the legislatures won't try to draw any. Maybe they'll just move it on to the courts. So then the courts will probably bring someone on to be able to help draw those official lines. And there might be some, I think League of Women Voters will be looking into trying to possibly leading some of that top level district mapping processes. So yeah, sorry, long-winded answer, but a lot of opportunity for people to host training, educational calls, and then also get involved in mapping, unity mapping, as well as the actual district mapping. And then also just to spread the word and continue to educate others. And yeah, if you know, our 102 session next Friday is open to everyone. So please, sign up, and hopefully I'll see you there.
So just want to get to the other groups quick. There was a question here, I believe Mary Browning, so room 3 had this question about the criteria the courts use when they create the district boundaries. Who do they listen to?
Yeah, so I'm trying to dig it up right now to actually find it. There's an individual by the name of Peter Watson who worked as a nonpartisan lawyer for the Minnesota Senate, who drafted kind of general principles and it's kind of just a rough explanation of all the things that I kind of went over. And they tend to use those principles. The interesting thing is trying to figure out whether or not you should order the principles. So when drawing the map, should you look at this before this? So should you be prioritizing communities of interest versus population? Or how do you make key decisions when a population might be over the amount, but still within the variance, but yet don't sacrifice this? And that's where it really becomes very difficult and kind of like a four-dimensional chessboard. But it's that's really where it's at. So I'll try to find that for you as well, Mary. That's a great question. They don't in an ideal world, the legislature would pass. This is another reform topic I've focused on, is if nothing else, the legislature should be able to decide what that is and pass it into law, so that all maps then are under the same principles or guidelines, whether it's drawn by the court, eventually drawn by the by a future legislature, but those things aren't. They're just not. There is no state statute or state law that really guides us. So that's really what is kind of scary.
I want to get to 2 more rooms. Room 2, Angela, Julene, did you guys have a question about a collective question you came up with?
So no, we
actually, yeah, we kind of we kind of deviated. We were the ones that went against the grain, but I think it's safe to say, and help me with this, Angela, that we spend a lot of time talking about, and I think it's connected to the whole piece connected to collective, specific to Native and African American people. And we started with conversations that she has recently had with her sons. And we were talking about what a different world and what a different conversation we'd be having now if, in fact, the natives were hip to the white man with this so-called Thanksgiving Day. As when they first did that, I think that was the first Maine massacre or whatever.
No.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I was talking to my dog. Go ahead.
And how things would be different, but then as she was saying, in terms of the number of tribes, it's extremely difficult to formulate a collective within the native population, if you will, let alone then moving that towards and including African American people. Angela, did I reflect our faux pas?
Yeah, but I would really like to add that, this is kind of coming from somebody who's been on a tribe before. So when you talk to me about redistricting, I just really find it hard to believe that we as a community have a say so when it comes to most of my people being put on tribes and basically saying you stay here, or going back to the 2016 pipelines in North Dakota and South Dakota, when a pipeline just got ran straight through private land that we deem sacred. So I just really, when it comes to redistricting, and no disrespect to you, Tom, I was listening to you, but I kind of felt my blood getting boiled, because when you say that we have a voice to speak up to it, my experience and being who I am, and being part of that, going over there protesting for the against the pipelines, that I don't really see that to be deemed and to actually be accurate.
Thanks, group two. No, we figured if we all, particularly for our fellows, we know folks aren't. I'm glad the discussion led to other things and about the complexities of community too and identity,
Correct.
and I think it's real, right? And so
Correct.
I appreciate folks talking about that too.
Yeah.
I want to
Okay.
leave time for room one to ask their question, group one to ask their collective question, and Chai asked folks to fill out a short, sweet survey about tonight's event. So if you have to head out, please fill that out. We'd love to hear from you over your thoughts and reflections. But we'll turn to group one. If you had a collective question, sorry if I missed it in the chat. Megan Cooley Mala, was there a collective
Well,
question?
most of our questions were, I think everyone else had too, but one I did not know that I think Megan brought this up, and Octavia had, and I don't want to quote you, Octavia, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't know that the census was in the Constitution, and is there something that we could change, I don't know about on the federal level, but perhaps on the Minnesota level to change the Constitution?
Absolutely. Yeah, you could see a constitutional amendment. I mean, that's one idea as well for an independent commission, that it would be put in the state's constitution as opposed to passing it into law, so that it would be a much higher bar to, to protect that if that was a change. I know that's been a bill that I think Common Cause has supported that bill in the past, and I'm not sure if Anastasia is back, but you certainly could, the state could choose to do that.
Yep, I'm back, literally. So what was the question on the bill? I heard something about a bill.
Oh, I was just asking how we could change the state's constitution to change the census, or not the census, change the redistricting process, or change the process as a whole. So we definitely could do that.
Yep, actually, we are in the process. We've drafted a bipartisan model bill for that, offering up a hybrid approach to having a citizens redistricting commission work in drafting those maps that we were just talking about, but also including the legislative body, in that it would require, absent a constitutional amendment, it would require us to still allow for the legislative body to engage in the approval of the maps, right? So in moving an advisory redistricting commission, what we're doing is maximizing transparency and accountability within the process, shedding some light on how that's being done, allowing for direct community input and participation on that, right? Through the advisory redistricting commission body itself. And what we would ideally want is an independent redistricting commission, but I'm sure Tom already mentioned this, that would require a constitutional amendment. We are not a ballot initiative state, so it's not as simply as, driving a grassroots ballot initiative around that, as you've heard a lot of other states being able to do, right? So the current bill is a both and approach, in that it does put forth a constitutional amendment for the 2022 ballot. And should that ballot initiative fail, it would default to the advisory redistricting commission. In fact, I just had a conversation with our, keeping my fingers crossed, chief Republican author in the Senate on that bill. And it is a bill that, by the way, both chambers, both the House and the Senate, have played a role in shaping what some of the language is contained in it, and also members from both sides of the aisle. Within that, right, within that chamber itself. So again, as I mentioned before, the biggest lie is that it's a political process. It is not a political process. It is a process by which communities that are being shaped by those maps, right, are supposed to be represented within that process. It's not the other way around. It's not community serving government, it's government serving community. And that's what we're trying to move forward. And believe it or not, we do have bipartisan support around that fundamental premise that it is the people who should be the focus and the ultimate power of our democracy.
So thank you, Anastasia. I'll let that be your last word. I know folks here had additional questions. I would encourage you all to follow up with our speakers. We will be sending out this recording as well as the handout. So check your email in the next day or two as Shai and I get all the templates together. On behalf of Nexus, I want to thank XP and Anastasia and Tom too for being our panelists tonight. And I want to thank you all for attending and engaging in this conversation. Lots of new stuff here that was brought up. And so I encourage you all to have conversations too about this work. I appreciate the reframing and talking about narrative, but it's, you know, again, what folks think of as something simple up front is actually, you know, laying bare a lot of the complexities that we have in our communities. And so I hope everyone has a wonderful night. If you haven't already, I'll make a last pitch for the survey. We do these issue series. We're just doing them twice during your program year. So we'll be back in early March with another issue series. So if you have suggestions for that, drop that in the survey too. So about topics impacting racial equity issues. All right, everyone, have a great night and have a wonderful holiday season. Enjoy all that holiday food. Dream we're on the beach somewhere.
I know
or
it is a
South
Christmas
Africa.
movie.
Yeah, and watch a holiday movie. So
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Jangle.
have a great evening. Yes, jingle
Thank you,
jangle.
Terry
Yes.
and Shai, too.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a
So
good
much.
night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Yeah. Should I just hang out for a few minutes and I think we'll be good to go?